Hi there, my name is Ron Rogers, and this video is entitled United States Air Force T-37 Instructor Pilot Tales, A Tale of Two Students. Now this video is a little more serious than one I have done before, and basically I talk about the responsibility and demands of being an instructor. In this case it's an Air Force instructor, but it applies to any instructor. I was very demanding of my students. I think all Air Force instructors are. We want them to do well. Nobody really wants the student to fail, but it's a tough course. It's demanding. You really have to perform, and we want our students to succeed, but we want them to be safe and we want them to be capable. The T-37 back then in the 70s when I was an instructor is the entry-level aircraft. And it's a reasonably fast aircraft, 200 to 300 knots, but it's intimidating. Lots of dials, lots of switches, lots of procedures, and we do lots of maneuvers. One of the things we do is stalls. Of course, you do that in any series of instruction. And one of the type of stalls we do is a power-on stall. Now in the T-37, what you do is you set power to 90%. You set the takeoff trim to where you have the green takeoff trim light, which is a little green light right in front of the student. And this is done so that you have a neutral trim setting when you're doing the stalls. And you pull the nose up to 40 degrees and you let it decelerate until you either get the stall or the wing rolls off. And once you do, you immediately pitch forward, go to 100% power, and recover. Well, Lieutenant Donovan, and I'm going to use the name here because it's significant for this, and it's disclosed in a little poem he wrote later to me. But what he had inadvertently done, and I had not realized immediately, was when he placed his hands on the stick, his two thumbs touched the trim knob, the little knob on top of the stick, and he inadvertently was running the trim full nose down. When the aircraft stalled and broke and he went to full power, we pitched down to 90 degrees very violently, and he attempted to pull out and he couldn't. The stick forces were extremely high. So I came on. I said, I've got it. The airspeed's accelerating rapidly. We are going straight down. And I happen to notice that the takeoff trim light is not illuminated. So I'm thinking we've got a trim situation here, runaway trim, whatever. So I start running the trim back. Of course, power's back, speed brakes are out. I'm running the trim back, and I'm able to recover the aircraft without overGing or overspeeding. And that was kind of a good lesson. We come back. Well, the tale got a little more interesting because within a couple of days, I was at Vance Air Force Base, and one of the other instructors that I had gone through instructor training with was at another base, and we're essentially in the same part of the syllabus because the classes started at the same time at both bases. And it came back that he had crashed and been killed. And it came out what had happened was they were doing power on stalls, and the student had inadvertently run the trim full nose down. And he told the student to bail out, but he was too late in getting out, and essentially the aircraft hit the ground as the ejection seat was just departing the aircraft. And when this was read in the morning briefing room, my student turned essentially white. But we survived that incident and we moved on. Now, you train in the aircraft, and again, it's fairly intense. You got a helmet, you got a parachute, you strap in, and it's confining, and it's very uncomfortable. But let's talk about the maneuvers. And right out of the T-37 flight manual, we have the overhead pattern. Now, in the military, in high performance jets, you fly a very tight overhead pattern. This is done to expeditiously get the aircraft on the ground, get a lot of patterns, and also it is a training tool that develops skill and ability, and also it is somewhat of a method of weeding out people who kind of can't hack it. You come down initial at 200 knots, you pitch out, 6-degree pitch out, put the speed brakes down, you get below 150 knots, you put the landing gear down. Below 135 knots, you start the flaps down, you come off what's known as the perch, you start the final turn, and it's 180-degree descending turn till you roll out on final at 100 knots and about 300 feet above the ground. And then you come in and land, and we typically did touch and goes. And if the traffic permitted, you immediately came around and got a close pattern and did another one. Otherwise, you had to go out the outside downwind and come around and re-enter initial and pitch out. This is a demanding pattern, and we're talking these students have less than 10 hours in the aircraft, and this is intense. Well, unfortunately, and I worked and worked with Lieutenant Donovan, and he just was never able to get the picture. And I mean, I tried everything. My flight commander worked with him, and it just didn't work. So things proceed through the program. He gets various check rides. He goes with more and more experienced instructors. He works up, and finally, the final flight, as referenced in the poem here, is 2805, and that was unsatisfactory. And unfortunately, he washed out. And this is a little poem that he wrote to me and presented with a painting that he had purchased. And this is still in my house now, and I honor it quite a bit. Well, so he washes out of pilot training, and he goes out to Mather Air Force Base, and he goes into navigator training. And one thing they do out there is they get a chance to fly, because a lot of people come in from different venues. They're not necessarily people who simply wash out of pilot training. They're people come in the outside. They don't have the visual acuity or other reasons. They come in as navigators. And he goes up with the instructor, and the instructor lets him fly. And in the process of him flying, the instructor says to him, "It was the final turn, wasn't it?" And he goes, "Yeah, I could never get the final turn." Well, like I said, we become friends. I've unfortunately lost contact over the years, but he got a position as a weapon system operator, backseater there, in the Wild Weasel, which was an F-105G squadron out at George Air Force Base at the time, which is right next to Edwards, where I was stationed. So I went over, and we visited and stuff like that, and he was having a fun time. These guys are wild. The fighter pilots here are pretty amazing, and the whole thing here, Wild Weasel, is it attacks SAM sites, radar sites, and it has a HARM missile on there, and it fires at the radar, and it takes them out. So you basically are tempting the lion here, and they lock onto you, and then you fire the missile, and you take them out. Well, next student. Now, like I said, the T-37 is rather intimidating. Flying the aircraft is only part of the whole issue. Going back to the flight manual here, we have the dreaded Section C, which is the emergency procedures. Now, we practice various emergencies, simulated emergencies in the aircraft, such as single engine approaches and things like that. But for the real emergencies, those are done in the simulator. Now, I was the Stanivel officer in the flight, so I'm the one primarily involved in the emergency procedures validation of the students. We'd have a stand-up briefing. I would get up there and I would give some certain situation like, you look over and you see you have 0 hydraulic pressure. What are you going to do? A little bit of pause. I call on a student. The student has to stand up and recite the procedure. And if they don't get it right, they're grounded for the day. Well, the other thing we do is, of course, we run through the emergency procedures in the simulator. And there was a student that I was referred to. I was more experienced at this time. I'd had several classes. And the student was referred to me because he was having trouble in the simulator. He tended to freeze up. And, basically, when something goes wrong, you have to fly the aircraft. You have to compartmentalize. You have to put This is really kind of scared me. Engine fires aren't wonderful, but you have to put that all aside, go through the procedures, handle the problem, fly the aircraft, and get a successful conclusion. And he was having a lot of difficulty, and I worked and worked with him, and he got better. I taught him how to basically compartmentalize, to focus on what needs to be done, and fly the airplane, handle the procedure. And it took quite a bit, but he got through the program. So he graduates from the T-37 program. He goes on to the T-38 program, and he does wonderfully. And I'm feeling really proud of myself. I said, this guy would have washed out if I hadn't worked so hard with him. But I got him through this part of the program, and now he's going on. And Dan was a very lucky guy. He married very well. Most of us, instructors and pilots, back then, it was not unusual to be married in your early 20s, and the majority of instructors and pilots were married. And he Dan married well. He married into a family that had many vineyards up in the Fresno area and was very well off. And he got a slot in the Fresno Air Guard flying the 106. Things are going well up to a point. I was out at Edwards. I'm sitting in my living room. I'm getting ready to go into work that day, and I'm reading the newspaper, and I read about an F-106 from the Fresno Guard that was doing an intercept on a T-33. They were about 1,100 feet, and they do this out over the water typically. And I've flown air combat maneuvering over the water, and it's very disorienting. First of all, you're all over the sky. Noses up, noses down. You're high G maneuvering. You've got blue sky, blue water, and if it's hazy out, you've got a very indistinct horizon. And you really have to glance at the instruments. I mean, you can tell if you're going down, it's getting noisier. You're going faster. If you're going up, the airspeed's decreasing. So that's a feedback. But what apparently happened was he broke off from the intercept, and instead of breaking up, he broke down. And the what they found was the tip tanks, which came off, and part of his helmet, which I was told was fairly typical. So that was a shock. So the question, of course, is, if I had washed him out, he'd have still been alive. But he did well, and he got through a tough spot. Lots of people have tough spots flying, and they get through them. But in the back of my mind, I kind of wish, if I'd have washed him out, his life may not have been as exciting, dramatic, and all that, but he'd probably still be alive. So that's the responsibility of an instructor. Thanks for watching.